how could the US actually help India in building infrastructure and really achieve that dream of a $5 trillion economy? Well, Prime Minister Modi is slated to visit the US next week. India and the US strengthening both strategic as well as economic ties. And ahead of the visit by the Indian Prime Minister, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has spoken, and she says the US is actively working to help India attract more private sector capital to close its infrastructure gap. So here on India Tonight, we are asking, what role will Biden and company actually play in building India's $5 trillion economy project? Let's discuss this. Joining us in a moment will be Ajay Dua, the former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Geoff Dennis is already with us. He's an independent emerging markets commentator. So, Geoff, to you first, do tell us about the possibility of this happening. How do you think the US is poised to help India attract that much more capital that could be infused in the infrastructure space?
I think what they're going to do is obviously encourage more partnerships between US companies and Indian companies so that we generate potentially more investment from US companies into India. That's a good starting point. And obviously this will be a focus of attention when Prime Minister Modi visits the US next week. So I think it's mainly a question of improving, if you like, the corporate links between the two countries. I mean, beyond that, obviously, I think what the US is trying to do is to support India in some sense, not just economically, but to a certain extent geopolitically, in not literally fighting off, but fighting off the increasing dominance of China in that part of the world. But as everybody knows on this channel, India is now the most populous country in the world. It has a very, very low GDP per head. It has enormous potential. That's what we economists always think about a country with a low GDP per head. It has to increase its investment. It has to increase its share of manufacturing industry in GDP. And I think what the US will be doing, therefore, as I say, is to encourage increasing links between US companies and Indian companies in order to further increase investment, including foreign investment, of course, in the Indian economy.
Building these links between Indian and US companies, let's ask Mr. Dua how easy that process could be, because Mr. Modi, as he arrives in the US and gets into negotiation mode to be able to attract that kind of capital that would be infused in the infrastructure space, how exactly is India poised, and the relations between India and US, how conducive are they at this point in time, Mr. Dua, to be able to really propel India on its course to achieve that dream of a $5 trillion economy?
We've never been better placed than we are currently, and at a time when the Prime Minister of India is being accorded, symbolically speaking, to say, state visit once in 4 years, which happens in the United States in every president's tenure just once in a while, and private dinner at the White House on the day he arrives. Next afternoon, a lunch hosted by Vice President, attended by the Secretary of State and other dignitaries, and later in the evening, a White House dinner, which I am given to understand is people just asking for tickets to attend that. That's symbolic. But I am going into more than the symbolic, the preparations which have gone into the visit of the Prime Minister of India are unprecedented. Almost every minister rank officer of the United States, be it the Defense Secretary, the Secretary for Treasury, Janet Yellen, or was it Mr. Austin, the Defense Secretary, Secretary of State, Finance Secretary, the Trade Secretary, almost you name it. And till yesterday, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was here. So a lot of preparatory work has gone in. And I expect that during this visit, right in the beginning, the works which have fructified. Those or the agreements, those will be announced on the 22nd morning itself, and that should include the order for the setting up of co-production in India of GE 141 engines, engines fit enough for the fifth generation fighters, and which is something which will augur very well for the start, followed by all kinds of meetings, including with top business executives, which Prime Minister Modi will be attending. Having said that, I think all the signals from the White House are we are talking of a strategic relationship with India, which is unprecedented.
On that note, of course, India, Mr. Dua, India has been consistently looking at building on its Make in India theme. Manufacturing is an entire sphere of activity that India has a lot of catching up to do. Geoff, in your understanding of emerging markets, this is going to be an important piece for India to build that manufacturing base. Because even right now, India's major exports to the US are gems and jewelry, pharmaceutical products, electronic goods, engineering products, and apparel. Within the entire ambit of possibilities that now exist and being able to attract American capital to be able to build India's infrastructure, this will require perhaps an expansion in the native trade and in the kind of investments that India needs to attract. How possible do you actually think it is on India's journey towards becoming that much bigger of an economy?
I think it is possible. I mean, I think first of all we must not play down too much the exports that are already going to the US, and some of the sectors that you mentioned, some of the specific companies that you mentioned, some specific product areas that you mentioned that are important. But as you know well, and the listeners know well, there's been a long-standing debate in the markets and in no doubt in India itself as to does India have the chance to build a manufacturing sector in its economy that is as big as China's has been, and since China joined the WTO in 2001. Now, the general opinion is that's been disappointing. I still don't rule that out as a possibility that if you look across emerging markets, India's manufacturing sector is not that big relative to a number of other countries, particularly China. Can they do that? Yes, of course. And what would facilitate that would be improved trade links between the US and India, increased investment by US companies into India, and also very, very importantly, the ongoing soundness of monetary policy in particular, which is very robust in India, and fiscal policy, which could improve. I think we would all agree in terms of the need perhaps for a more investor-friendly environment, lower taxes, but also a lower budget deficit, all of which would bring the cost of capital down. And so I think a lower cost of capital would play a big role here. Now, in other words, I don't believe necessarily that this goal of building a much bigger manufacturing sector has passed India by. It's too early to assume that, although obviously just because we want to compare India with China doesn't mean to say it's ever going to be as big a manufacturing sector in relative terms as is the case in China. But the opportunity is there, and these increasing links, investment, trade, and a lower cost of capital will be the sort of thing that will encourage India to move in that general direction. Frankly, I'm pretty constructive about that, not least because of this gigantic labor force that is available, some of it quite well educated to work in these industries to increase these exports.
But Mr. Dua, despite the possibilities, it is something of a task as far as trade deficit in India is concerned, and that has been a yawning gap for the trade surplus. And I was looking at the current figures as well. Between India and the US, the trade currently is not as high as it could have possibly been for the years that India and US have come closer together in trade ties. So at this point in time, it becomes very crucial for India to build these ties. And as far as the possibilities are concerned, when you look at the services sector, there is a huge role for that sector to play as well. Where do you think India is going to push for the most? As much as it would like to build infrastructure, where do you think the US interests are going to lie, considering that Geoff is also talking about geopolitical concerns that the US will be looking at serving their interests in the region as well?
See, rather than guessing, I would go about with the preparations and the kind of understandings which have been reached. In January this year, we had started with the US the initiative on critical and emerging technologies. In its meeting, subsequent meetings, the areas of cooperation stand identified, and in which the US government recognizes that the cooperation has to be between the private sector, companies on both the sides, and that the US will facilitate it with removal of export controls and licensing conditions for a whole lot of technology which goes into these items. And the fields, just very quickly, quantum computing, talking of raw materials, defense, next generation telecom, or space, biotech, semiconductors, all these areas have been identified, and either side has been agreed would work towards making sure and concrete progress to be made through constant monitoring. Having said that, I would say, yes, hitherto we haven't exploited, though our trade might have reached across the figure of $190 billion two-way trade, and that we haven't been exporting hitherto technology-based products or high-tech-based products. But if technology, we do have a constraint of technology. If such controls on technology movement into India first identified and then minimized, I'm sure I'm not talking of India being as big a manufacturer as China. We are talking of the China plus strategy. In that, I think India is well poised, and I do expect, with the correct political signals coming and the private sector on both sides being very enthusiastic. Yesterday's meeting in India, US-IBC meeting, which Mr. Blinken attended, what was the outcome? Economic ties at heart of Indo-US strategic partnership. This is the Secretary of State's term used there.
Yes.
The meeting was...
No, absolutely.
The
there is no taking away. In fact, we've heard from Piyush Goyal as well. And a goal has been set of $500 billion in the coming 7 to 8 years. They want bilateral trade to be around $500 to $600 billion. How much of that is going to be achieved, and the kind of negotiations that will be at play when Mr. Modi is visiting the US, that's going to be in the spotlight. But Geoff Dennis and Mr. Dua, thank you very much for joining us with your perspective on this. We'll keep monitoring it.